Let me tell you about our wonderful speaker. Chris Vials is a professor of English and American Studies at the University of Connecticut. He is the author of Haunted by Hitler, Liberals, the Left, and the Fight Against Fascism in the United States, 2014. He is also the editor, with Bill Mullen, of the U.S. Anti-Fascism Reader, published by Verso Press in 2020. He has appeared in numerous media venues in the US and Canada to speak on fascism in the United States, past and present, including National Public Radio, PBS, the CBC, and Jacobin Magazine. Vials is currently working on a history of far-right movements in the United States from the 1920s to the present in comparative perspective, paying particularly close attention to their views of democracy and their relationships to violence. Chris has been very generous to us, lecturing for Charter Oak since 2016. He is an excellent teacher, and it is always a privilege to learn from him. Thank you, Chris, for being willing to address us again tonight. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Professor Chris Vials.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for that very generous introduction, and thanks also to Donna Berman for setting this up, and thanks to everyone for being here. I know that you had many choices of what you could do with your evening, and you chose to come here, so I really genuinely appreciate this. And what Daniel said is true. It's funny, I've been doing these talks to this group and to other venues since the very beginning of Trump, and it's interesting how the conversation has changed, right? Where, I feel like that the conversation has moved in from like, can it happen here to, wow, it seems to be happening here and what can we do about it, right? And that is where I kind of want us to go. And, so with the first part of this talk is, I'll cover the kind of the scary stuff, but then, hopefully kind of get to some of the more hopeful stuff towards the end. So bear with me on that. My point here is not just to scare people, but to actually give people a sense of the kind of the limits of this kind of power that you're seeing too. And also too, I should say also part of I forgot to mention kind of in my bio too, I'm coming at this subject, one as a kind of a scholar of authoritarianism and fascism and its link to the United States, but also what I'll be kind of bringing into this talk is a couple other roles I have right now. So I'm president of the American Association of University Professors at UCONN, which is the union that represents 2,500 faculty. So I'm very much engaged in that kind of history that's unfolding in the attacks on universities, and can speak to that. I'm also a co-founder with a colleague, Kathleen Tonry, of the Neighbor Fund, which is a group in Willimantic that basically does legal support, raises money for legal support for immigrants, right? So I'm kind of coming to this subject from those kind of two lived experiences, and seeing, interestingly and kind of strikingly, some of the same lawyers that we were using to kind of help out, migrants, now we're using for international students and international faculty at UConn, right? So it's a case study of first they came for the most marginalized, then they come for people closer to home and closer and closer and closer. So I'm going to cut over to the PowerPoint, and I want to stress I'm going to try to leave some time for discussion afterwards, for sure, because I know I'm very curious to hear about the subject of authoritarianism from you too, because I think we all come to this from very different kind of family histories, right, and experiences. So I'd like to hear your perspectives on this topic too. So I'm gonna just see, hopefully this will work okay. Okay. All right. Let's see. I'm just gonna do a quick thing up here. Me for the text, see if this works. Okay. First of all, can everybody hear me okay? A thumbs up. Okay. And can everybody see the screen? Okay. So where I kind of want to begin with this is when we're talking about authoritarianism or totalitarianism, to kind of really kind of go away with kind of certain stock images. And this is just, I typed in totalitarianism on Google, and this is like the first thing that comes up, right? But I think it captures a particularly, striking image. This idea that under authoritarianism, the state controls absolutely every aspect of life, and regiments and homogenizes everyone. And you see that this standing in front of, in attention and military formation, everyone in gray uniforms, all of this stuff. This the stuff of kind of dystopian literature that you see in shows like The Handmaid's Tale or Man in a High Castle, right? And this has a basis in some reality, but I think if we have this extreme maximalist view of authoritarianism, we're kind of going to miss the subtleties of it and might actually miss when it's actually happening, which is usually, even in the case of, Mussolini's Italy or Stalin's USSR, it wasn't this dramatic, right? So going forward here, so there's an interesting book that came out about 5 years ago called How Dictatorships Work, right? And it was by 2018, and it's a very dry book, but I'll synthesize like the main point here. So authoritarian regimes begin in a lot of different ways, and it's one of them that I want to concentrate on here. So these authors found, and they looked at how authoritarian regimes came to power in all these different governments after World War II, and they found that since World War II, about half of authoritarian regimes came to power through a coup d'etat. 16% were imposed by foreign powers to that country. 15% was this thing called authoritarianization that I want to unpack a lot because I think it's what we're seeing here in the US. 14% through some kind of guerrilla insurgency, another 5% by popular uprising, and then another 5% by just one group of elites kind of supplanting another. So in other words, these regimes never begin necessarily in the same ways, and they range from coup d'etat to popular movements to something else. But one thing that I want to highlight here is this one middle category called authoritarianization, which is in the increasing way in which new regimes of authoritarianism are being created, right? And this is increasingly over the 21st century in particular. And what that looks like, there was a concept called competitive authoritarianism that was devised by some political scientists back in 2010. And this is again way before Trump. They were before but they were working in the United States, and authoritarianization or competitive authoritarianism, how that looks like is that it's an authoritarian government that keeps a lot of democratic institutions in place on paper, but in elections might actually happen. But elections happen in some kind of skewed playing field where the opposition has almost no chance of winning. So, in other words, in one type of authoritarian power grab, it's not like a coup d'etat or anything, but it's basically one party gets into office by getting elected, then kicks out the ladder and makes it almost impossible for any other power to come in. And we've seen, and that's increasingly how new authoritarian regimes are happening in the 21st century. And it's Viktor Orban's Hungary is a good example of this, which the far right in this country venerates. Trump venerates. So is Hun Sen's Cambodia. So there's a lot of these kind of governments. Erdogan's Turkey is more and more getting this way. So there's a lot of examples of this, and how this looks. In this kind of 21st century authoritarianism. So where one party gets into power and kicks out the ladder for everyone else. There's a combination of legal repression where the ruling party controls the judiciary, selectively applies the law against its opponents, right? So it might be like, okay, if you insult Trump, or insult Putin, where Putin's got this down to a hilt, we're going to use defamation laws or libel laws to kind of make your life very difficult, even send you to jail, right? Or we're going to let our lawbreakers out of prison and put you in prison for the slightest infraction of the law, right? So it's this very uneven application of the law. Media control. So in 21st century authoritarianism, what happens is the ruling party controls most of the media, but they do so not by killing or jailing their opponents necessarily, but they just might refuse to offer them broadcasting licenses. So in this case, it wouldn't be that they would necessarily kill or jail everyone at MSNBC. They would just refuse them a broadcasting license, right? And make it difficult to get their message out, or impossible, right? So Another thing is uneven access to state resources. Ruling party uses government contracts to build up its own kind of power base, turn a profit, all of this stuff at its opponent's expense. There might also be voter suppression and rigging of elections, right? This is more familiar in a US context. Just make it more difficult for the opposition party to actually get in power through all kinds of like parliamentary shenanigans, right? And so the upshot of this is that if you look at authoritarianism this way and in this lens, rather than the kind of men in gray suits all standing in a line, what you start to see is, okay, authoritarianism, it's not that it's like maybe it'll happen here. This is happening here, right? This is what it looks like. I mean, this is a standard playbook in the world right now, right? And I'm not saying that just to scare people, but and the flip side of this is it's the 21st century authoritarianism. Daily life might go on pretty similarly for most people, and in fact, it's it's a lot less violent and bloody oftentimes than the old authoritarianism. That's the good news. The bad news is it's still authoritarianism, right? And on this note, oftentimes if this is successful, one party or leader stays in power for decades, and they might have elections every 4 years, but it's little mystery who's going to win. Also, like I said, it's less murderous than the kind of the old full authoritarianism of something like Gaddafi's Libya or Pinochet's Chile, or of course Nazi Germany, but it's still violent, right? And I included some examples here, but I want to say a bit on content, and I want to try to be a bit briefer here. So there's also the word fascism that comes up. And keep in mind, when we're talking about authoritarianism, fascism is one type of authoritarianism. There's many types, right? And once we get in, authoritarian just generally refers to kind of the antithesis of democracy. There's no free speech. There's no kind of liberal democratic rights. There might be minimal rule of law, right? It's kind of a large category. There are many kinds of authoritarianism, right? And they can be left wing, they can be right wing, they can be centrist, right? And this is just a kind of a Venn diagram, but I'm not going to go through all of it. But you have, your communist states on the left. You have in the center, you have like Mexico before 1988. You have certain kind of conservative oligarchies, right? This is very common in Latin America. And then you have fascism, which is a particular kind of right-wing authoritarianism. And I want to spend a little time unpacking it, because even though I don't think the United States is going towards Nazi Germany per se, or going to become Nazi Germany, I do think the fascist label is fitting for what we're seeing if we're thinking about that as a broader category with Trump particularly. Now, fascism, kind of a working definition that I'm going for here. This is my standard boilerplate, and there's many others have other definitions, other scholars of this, but fascism is a particular strand of right-wing politics, which found fullest expression in Italy and Germany from the 20s to the 40s, and is based around militarism, this masculine fetish of action, anti-Marxism, violent racist drive for authoritarian rebirth, right? And so, with fascism, it's a particular kind of right-wing politics that's not so much about just simply tax cuts, or just elite rule, or even necessarily just one lunatic holding on to power. There's a whole vision behind it, right? And there's a whole kind of ethos behind it. And it's really not just about restoring power to elites, although elites will have their power restored, but it's a broader kind of vision about that. And what really drives it is this idea of national rebirth, and like kind of putting women in their place, putting national minorities in their place, or exterminating them, right? So fascism has a particular resonance as a kind of right-wing politics. Now, on this note, keeping in mind that there have been kind of fascist states in the past, kind of mercifully few of them, Italy, Spain, Imperial Japan. People debate about Spain, Franco Spain. But then there's also, even though there's been mercifully few fascist states, there's been fascist movements and fascist parties all around the world, right? Every country has had these, including the United States, France, Mexico. All have had their shirt movements, all have had their functional equivalents. but only in a few states have they really taken full power. So with Trump, what we're kind of, even though I'm saying that Trump has real fascist elements and there's fascist elements in his party, in his MAGA movement, and I'll get to those in a second. It's not clear that he'll completely turn the state into a full fascist state, right? And that really depends on us, and that depends on the opposition to it, right? Now, I'm going to go blow past some of this, but why I say kind of I think that label is justified for MAGA in certain ways is that first of all, the authoritarianism driving it. There's an attempt to rule by decree and an attempt to bend all branches of government to the will of the strong man, right? And there's also the rhetoric of national renewal, which you're all familiar with, encompassed neatly in a little red baseball cap, return to a fantasy origin of make America great again, right? But it's not just any narrative of national renewal. It's one that's racist, misogynist, fanatically anti-communist, even though there hasn't really been communists in this country in any significant degree since the 30s and 40s. But it's a national review vision of national review renewal based on all of those grounds, right? And it also, what it does, what MAGA does, which is consistent with other fascist movements, is it places male violence and vengeance at the very center of public life, right? So it's all of these elements, not just one thing, but all of them crystallized to. I would actually say that label of fascism does kind of apply to MAGA, right? But again, I want to stress it's not clear that because it's a fascist movement that the United States is definitely going to become, Mussolini's Italy or something, though it might. Now, just to unpack that for a second here, about that putting vengeance and male violence at the center of public life. So I've been to a couple Trump rallies because this is what I do for research. One was in Hartford, one was in Waco, Texas, more recently. And because I was at these rallies, I get their campaign materials, I get their daily emails, and I started seeing this one a lot around 2019, 2020, right? No, I'm sorry, around we're more like 2023, something around there, 2024. With this image of Trump, it's like for those who have been wronged and betrayed, I am your retribution. You got a lot of you guys in here have been around in politics more than I have. Probably never seen a political candidate put something like this out there before, and it's striking, right? And to me, why it's so striking and it encapsulates the essence of MAGA, which ties it to fascism, is this idea that fascism doesn't really necessarily fill people's bellies. It's not going to make people materially better off. And a lot of people, some people think it will, but it really never does. It doesn't fill your bellies, but it will fill the darkest parts of your soul if you're a particular type of person. And the darkest parts of your soul, meaning the parts that are craving violence and violence against your enemies. And this is what Trump is so good at amongst his base, which is to basically tell his base that any attack on me is an attack on you. And and even though my enemies will come after me and claim that I'm corrupt, that's an attack on you. And so while I will not necessarily fill your bellies, I will give you the satisfaction of having your enemies and everybody who makes you feel bad, seeing them go down violently, right? So that's part of his whole thing. And for that reason, I don't know how many people have seen this icon. It's oftentimes you'll see it on pickup trucks, the Punisher symbol, right? And it's from a particular comic, The Punisher, right? And this is one from 1987 that's been adapted to film several times. But it's basically the story of a man, the Punisher, as kind of a villain, like an anti-hero who is a veteran who comes home from war and is kind of spat on and betrayed. And so betrayed by his country, and he comes back home from war, and he's not honored, but he's basically, has his wife and kids gunned down by gangs. So he becomes a vigilante and takes the law into his own hands. And this figure of the Punisher, I think, is really kind of central to the whole kind of culture of MAGA. Because when I went to Trump rallies, I didn't see any kind of, you know, actual fascist iconography from Mussolini, or of course not Hitler. But I won't say, of course not Hitler, but I didn't see anything from the actual history of fascism. But I saw this logo everywhere, right? And you see it amongst his base. And what that taps into is this, and in German, it's like the Durchstoßlegende. It's like the stabbed in the back mythos, right? The fact that, you know, all of these people, and this is from the Freikorps of in Weimar, Germany in 1920. This is you know, a tank crew, basically. Their image was the skull, and I'm not just putting this in there for the image of the skull, but it's not uncoincidental that, you know, you get back home from war, and, you know, you're betrayed and you're stabbed in the back after World War One. And who is responsible? It's, you know, the Jews, the communists, you know, all of these people. And, you know, the whole point of politics is to extract vengeance on your enemies, right? And and to make you feel human and whole again, because you've extracted vengeance on your enemies. And so you're okay with symbols of kind of death as your main iconography, right? And I mean, you have to, most of us might take a step back from this and go, hey, if your image is the skull, maybe you're not the good guys, right? You know, to kind of back up on that. But so I'm just kind of, you know, doing this kind of a, you know, extended exegesis on this, just because I wanted to kind of go into the culture of MAGA, and to say that yes, we're facing authoritarianism, but we are facing something really from the darkest corners of the last 100 years of politics, right? And something that was never really killed after World War II. Now, to dial it, you know, to continue that, and then I'll start to kind of reel it back a bit. So let's not forget, when we're talking about MAGA, you know, that the guy behind it is Stephen Miller. So Trump, as you've probably seen, doesn't have much of a vision, probably beyond his own narcissism and his own adoration. But there are people behind him who do, right? And this guy, Stephen Miller, you've heard of, who was the kind of policy architect of Trump 1.0, and he's still even more ensconced in Trump 2.0. And this is, I don't know why this is just not a deal killer, and it's telling that it's not, but this has been known for a long time, that when Stephen Miller was at Breitbart magazine, far right magazine, which is now an online website, or sorry, it's always been a website, but it's a web magazine. He helped kind of form the alt-right, and the alt-right is openly fascist, right? And he encouraged his staff to repost from the American Renaissance. And the American Renaissance has been in the Southern Poverty Law Center's crosshairs for quite some time. It was founded by, in 1990, by a guy, Jared Taylor, and who is an active, and it has an active neo-Nazi following. American Renaissance. This is what Stephen Miller kind of had his staff read and wanted to post on Breitbart. And it's the American Renaissance, again, what Stephen Miller is deeply into, was devoted to biological racism, meaning, like, you know, the articles about the genetic superiority of whites over blacks and Latinos, right? You know, and so the architect behind Trumpism and his immigration policy is a dyed-in-the-wool actual fascist, right? And somehow that is not discussed, right? It's just normalized. It's just normal now, right? And we've, even though journalists have talked about this for a long time, and there's a very good book on this from a journalist called Hate Monger, if you want the kind of full details of, you know, Stephen Miller's kind of sordid history. Now, going forward from this, kind of the then and now, and some of the limits of comparison to kind of Nazi Germany and to kind of the fascist movement of the 30s and 40s, even though I've kind of said that, you know, Trump falls into that a bit, is that keep in mind that the interwar years of the 20s and 30s were a very specific conjuncture, a very specific kind of moment where all of these particular factors combined, you know, that made very fertile ground for fascism. And you can kind of, like, you know, tease out what you think is still relevant or not, right? I'm just going to kind of lay out a few things that historians have identified. One of the things to keep in mind with the original fascism is fascists never won the popular vote. They seized power typically after losing elections or after electoral declines. So, in other words, fascists, you know, even they didn't necessarily even come to power through competitive authoritarianism. They didn't really even win an election. They just basically were handed power by a parliamentary maneuver after they were not doing too great, right? So that's one factor. Also, one difference between that and the present is that you had World War One, which had killed 10 million people, mostly in Europe, up to that point was the most devastating, traumatic war in European history, probably since the 1500s or the 1600s, right? Since the 30 Years' War, right? So the World War One had left whole populations kind of traumatized and introduced them to also to new forms of militarism that were permeated throughout the whole country. And if you read Mussolini and Hitler's biographies, that whole sense of trauma of being a kind of a wounded veteran is like central to their whole kind of ethos and worldview. Also, there was major rapid economic instability in the interwar years, particularly in the 1930s, but also in Italy, post-World War I Italy, there was a lot of instability. The Nazi Party in Germany was a super fringe party in German politics until 1929. Then they exploded exponentially, right? So the Nazis were, around since 1919, but nobody had really much heard of them until the 30s itself. So that background is one of major economic instability. Also, the political left and cultural change was quite strong and deeply frightening to conservative forces in the 20s and 30s. I do think this is kind of a similarity to the present moment, keeping in mind that and this is as an educator, I've this has changed maybe a little bit, but young people tend to be more kind of liberal and left than I've seen them in since I started teaching. Right there is a kind of a progressive and left kind of cultural shift in this country, notwithstanding the last election results. That's quite real. Also, 19th century kind of colonialism had unleashed a whole new racial vocabulary, a whole new mode of imperialism, right? So there's a lot of things that kind of went into effect in the interwar years. Some of these apply now, some of them kind of are really part of that moment. But suffice to say, you're never really going to see the same kind of ferment, the exact same political ground as you see kind of 100 years later, and you shouldn't expect that. But certain kind of fascisms persist. Now, also the last thing, because I'll come back to this, one big difference between interwar Europe and Japan and today is that places where fascism took place or they became full fascist states, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain, they were all places where like liberal democracy and traditions of liberal democracy were very thin. Germany had a history of kind of, ruled by the Kaiser, right? Italy had constitutional monarchy and had only been really a country since the 1870s. Japan barely had any experience with democracy, as did Spain, right? So all of these countries that went full fascist had very little tradition of liberal democracy behind them. Now, the fact that the United States does have that history behind it doesn't make us safe, but it helps a bit. And I'll get back to that in a minute. Now, I'm going to, just for interest of time, just kind of blow past this. So certain kind of the terrain of Trump 2.0, a few things as somebody who looks at the cultural history of the right and authoritarianism, some of the things that strike me that are, somewhat depart from the earlier authoritarianisms. And as I mentioned before, the fact that the United States has a long history of liberal democratic tradition means that there's a lot of deeply held cultural norms that need to be broken in order to become fully authoritarianized. And the Trump team is working on breaking those norms really fast. And and you've seen this. Anybody who's read the newspaper kind of knows what I'm talking about. So a lot of our kind of legal system is held together by norms. Like, okay, a judiciary issues a ruling, and you're supposed to obey that ruling, and all previous people did, and he's not, right? And so there's talk of constitutional crisis. What does this mean? This is really, but those traditions are not meaningless, right? They do present kind of barriers to them doing what they want, and that I'll get back to kind of at the end. Their power is not absolute. There are certain expectations in this country, but they are working to whittle those down and create new norms dramatically, to be sure. Now, also, as I've mentioned before, a consideration here that this one kind of ties us to the past in certain ways is the political left and progressive culture has grown significantly in the United States, and polling has really not shown a kind of overall rightward shift on all issues, notwithstanding the results of the last election. Now, younger generations tend to be more progressive, though that's not absolute. The people who are most generationally most conservative and most kind of MAGAfied are actually people of my age group, the Generation X, the people who grew up in the 1980s. We're like politically, and we're the kind of the most kind of MAGAfied of any kind of generation, right? That's the kind of the heart of the Trump base, and so but also keeping in mind here, this is, I think, some of what I'm seeing, which is almost puzzling from somebody who studies authoritarianism, is that usually authoritarians fully authoritarianize the state. They fully kind of make the state authoritarian, and then they enact really unpopular stuff that hurts people's everyday life. Now, this crew has gone out the other way. They haven't fully authoritarianized the state yet. They haven't fully converted it to, their dreamy, non-democratic rule, but they're already proposing things and doing things that's going to make life a lot worse. Like cutting Medicare, Medicaid, tariffs that are going to feel like inflation and are going to be inflation. Even though they're rolling some of them back, it's merely going to be 10% inflation, which is precisely what killed Biden. And so usually the playbook is from authoritarians, again, seize power, make it impossible for people to vote against you, and then you do the things that are hurtful. They're doing it the other way around. They haven't fully converted the state in the ways they want it, but they're doing this unpopular stuff already. So that, to me, kind of to suggest that they don't know what they're doing, and it's going to be kind of a little bit of a limit to their goals. We've seen relatively little paramilitary violence, in Trump 2.0. One could easily argue that's because they control the reins of the state. ICE and Customs and Border Patrol are their militia. You could make that case, but that said, even in the kind of historical fascist regimes and even a lot of the authoritarian regimes, they still maintain kind of these posse deputized forces that go after their political enemies, right? Even after they take power, right? So, but we've seen, for whatever reason, very little of that in the U.S. Also, the institutional targets are much more comprehensive this time around than in Trump 1.0. In other words, they're targeting government agencies and universities and this boogeyman called DEI, in ways that they really never kind of went to before. And we're certainly feeling this at universities. It's quite real, right? But their implementation is very chaotic and inept, even by the standards of authoritarian regimes, right? So the thing with Trump handpicking loyalists to do his bidding, basically, and to putting loyalists without much experience in positions of high power, Hegseth and Kash Patel, etc. That's kind of standard for authoritarians to pick loyalists, right? Because they're not operating by rule of law anymore. They need people who will break the law and jump off a cliff with them. But what is a little bit unique with Trump is that they to an uncanny extent, they know how to break things, but they don't know how to build institutions, right? So they don't even know how to build like a repressive apparatus very well. And we've seen this just by the sheer randomness of some of their targets. Now they kind of backtrack away from this. So we've got a particularly myopic strongman here, right? And I think that is a kind of one of the vulnerabilities of their style of kind of authoritarian rule is just the myopicness of their kind of strongman, and he can't seem to have a vision beyond his own kind of personal vendettas, right? Now, I'm getting to the end of my presentation here. So one of the things, and this is where I'll kind of bring in some kind of local knowledge from my other hat of doing work with the Neighbor Fund in Eastern Connecticut. An interesting thing that we have seen in Eastern Connecticut and Willimantic, where there's a very large undocumented immigrant population, is that we actually haven't seen a massive uptick in ICE raids, right? What we have not locally seen this massive wave of deportations that Trump talked about. What we're seeing is kind of pretty much akin to Trump 1.0, which, you get some ICE raids here and there, and maybe it's a slight uptick, but it's not even clear if it's an uptick over Biden, right? And that's anecdotal, right? That's just one community. And it's a small town, which is not necessarily targeted in the way that kind of New York or Los Angeles or Chicago would be, but it's kind of borne out statistically. And this is forwarded by another activist who does in Hartford, Constanza Segovia, who also does interesting kind of does a Hartford deportation defense, which is like our organization Willimantic. This is from like a researcher, Austin Kocher. We are seeing an uptick in detentions, but it's still not up to the level as it was when Biden took office in 2020, and it still is not kind of caught up to the level that it was kind of before. But so we're not seeing the kind of mass deportations yet that were kind of promised. But one of the same researcher did see a pattern in the deportations, the detentions, where there's a lot more people detained by ICE and a lot less people detained by Customs and Border Patrol, meaning they're stopping a lot more people at the border, and they are doing more internal kind of detentions, right? So they are doing some internal detentions by this data, but it's not the kind of massive, overwhelming, like concentration camp state that has been promised. Now we could see that, especially if the Trump folks are not stopped, but we're not seeing it quite yet, right? And so and that kind of brings me to I'll go past this, but actually, let's see. Brings me kind of to a final point, which is kind of solutions and kind of what to do. And again, this is not a strategy session, but I can offer a few kind of final words here from this history. Is that it's very important to kind of stop the authoritarian slide early before it's complete. Once authoritarians kind of completely get into power and completely authoritarianize the state, it can be difficult to dislodge them. And we could be talking about something that could take a generation to do, right? So it's very important to stop this early. Also, partially because there's no such thing as an ex-dictator. And once people have, authoritarians in their inner circle have disregarded the rule of law repeatedly up to and including murder, they know there's no going back, right? So once they start breaking the law left, right, and center, and even if they start killing people, that's why dictators never relinquish power, because if you rule by the sword, you're going to die by the sword. So there's only three paths for to oust a dictator from office. You kill them, right? They end violently, as many have done, Gaddafi to Mussolini, or they go into exile, right? Or they go to prison, right? So once they and their inner circle are in power, they're fully committed, right? So you got to stop that before kind of it happens, right? fully, and it's still not fully happened. Also, this is a clear lesson from history. There's oftentimes in the opponents of fascist regimes or fascism, I've seen a lot of kind of left and liberal sectarianism, right? People have to get over that. You have to have broad coalitions. You have to form coalitions with people who you don't agree with on points. Maybe they're people who sound a bit too leftist, or maybe there are some people who don't sound leftist enough, or people who sound, too conservative. The fact is, you have an authoritarian enemy. You ally with whoever you need to ally with in broad coalitions to form against that kind of enemy, right? So broad coalitions, time and time again, way to go, and the way to stop it before it gets too deep and dark in. And some of the traits that have moved authoritarians to position of power, and also oftentimes, are the same traits that undo them, right? So, for example, Trump's kind of vengeance, as I talked about earlier, that's what resonates with his base, and one of the things that helped him consolidate full control of the Republican Party. It's also the things that makes him repellent to everyone who's not in that base, right? And so you have to kind of exploit that. You have to kind of exploit that kind of contradiction in who they are, right? Also, the kind of final point: authoritarians puff themselves up as all powerful, and they try to convince you that their power is inevitable and that their reach is absolute, but don't buy it, right? There's always kind of, again, behind every authoritarian, a frail little boy, right? And there's behind every authoritarian drive to power, there's always weakness, right? And they do need some popular support, but they have an uncanny way of doing things that alienates absolutely everyone, right? So, I mean, this is not like a strategic kind of playbook for how to defeat. These are just some kind of broad lessons. But, keep in mind, whereas going back to fascist states, whereas every country has had fascist movements have been stopped in their tracks in most cases, right? Even when they've gotten pretty close, right? So we're facing, and I would say, very scary times, but the kind of the track record of history and the odds of history are kind of on the sides of the opponents of authoritarianism in a lot of ways, right? But it is one thing that it's very clear that none of us can be kind of bystanders to history. We have to be active participants of it. And to be active participants of it, we have to kind of let go of the fear, of participating and of doing what we can, whether it's kind of open resistance or whether it's more kind of muted things, given our positions, what we can get away with. But fear is what they thrive on. They count on you not doing anything, right? Because you think they're all powerful or their reach is absolute, and that's never the case, right? So I'll leave it there, and I'll kind of stop it there. Give us a bit of time for kind of Q&A, and I thank you for being such a great audience. So.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was really illuminating. I've got a quick question. Do you have anything that you feel optimistic about at the moment?
Yeah, just the fact that they're screwing up so much. I mean, the fact that the one kind of point that I said kind of before is, first of all, they don't control the hearts and minds of most people. If you look at Viktor Orban's Hungary, which is a very successful model, Viktor Orban did everything that they're not doing. Viktor Orban is popular with most people, even though he's very authoritarian. But he's popular with most people precisely because he did what Trump and them are not doing. He went after Roma, the Roma population, what used to be called gypsies, right? He went after them. He went after immigrants. He went after women's rights. But he also preserved social benefits. He also was okay with unions. He also did things that actually helped improve the standard of living for a lot of people, right? Trump is doing the opposite of that. You've got Doge, you've got Elon Musk, who no one likes. You've got like, this plan to possibly cut Medicare, Medicaid. You've got these unpopular tariffs that are going to make life, more difficult. All of the things that are doing is the opposite of what you should do in an authoritarian playbook. And it's also happening within a cultural terrain in which the hearts and minds of people structurally are not really totally down with what they're doing. So
Interesting. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions? Somebody's got to have questions. Yeah, David.
Can you speak a little more to what might be necessary in terms of civil disobedience?
yeah, I mean, I will say, this is something not as my kind of scholar hat, but I will say that in these kind of regimes, you have to be very careful in ways that you were not before, including the Trump government, right? Because they're weaponizing the way that they were talking about making, Tesla vandalism, an act of terrorism. One thing you can expect is that things like civil disobedience might be considered terrorism now. They're already kind of going there a little bit. So I would caution you about, I'm not, this might counteract what I said, but about not giving into fear, but certain fears are rational. We've had some people in the like in Willimantic who wanted to kind of lay down in front of ICE vans and things like that and prevent ICE from taking people away. I have not encouraged people to do that at all. I've dissuaded them from doing it because they're going to throw the book at you in ways that you haven't been done. So there's other ways to do this in a regime like this that are a little bit to resist, that are maybe a little bit safer. If you feel okay with going to prison for a bit, like, I mean, and if you can withstand that, all more power to you. But in this moment, things like protests, things like, consumer boycotts, things like, writing your congressman, trying to everything you can do to embolden justices, and embolden kind of oppositional politicians, being out in the street. I will say on that note that, liberal justices, or, your oppositional politicians or oppositional justices are only going to be emboldened to do what they do if they see people out there visibly being a presence and visibly opposing. So the most important thing that people can do, I think, right now is less civil disobedience. So that's cool, but really just being out there in the street and being visible, right? And being actually in a presence in a space where people can see you.
I appreciate what you're saying. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Oh, Catherine.
Do you think there's a different flavor going on these days because of technology and Elon Musk connecting through Starlink and the biometrics and all that stuff going on? And it's they know a lot about us now.
They do, and I that's a really good question. I get a lot about that kind of question a lot in these talks. But what I'm just kind of seeing, and we've seen this at University of Connecticut too, with the 14 international students who were, like their visas withheld, and were about to get deported, and then the justice went after that. It seems like people are being targeted by these distant algorithms that are really sloppy. And I think they have AI, and they have these programs and algorithms, but I haven't seen evidence that they're very fine-tuned, or they're very effective. They don't have the equivalent of a J. Edgar Hoover, who's kind of tracking down dissidents like they did in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. They have this sloppy algorithm that at UConn locally we couldn't tell any rhyme or reason why these 14 people were given the boot. None of them were involved in the kind of the Palestine protests. Like their national origins are all over the place. That might have been some kind of, with some of them, it might have been kind of a traffic ticket or a minor infraction, but even that's not universal. So I'm not kind of cowed by these technologies that they have yet, because I haven't seen them use them particularly effectively. They've got a lot of data and a lot of access, but I don't think they've figured out how to do anything with it, right? They may in the future, but they just don't seem very capable, right?
On a similar
Thank
note,
you.
we saw so much activity early on in this administration. In your sense of things, do you think things have slowed a little bit, or are they still full speed ahead?
It's hard to say. I mean, I'd have to look at, it seems like you would expect a lot more executive orders at the very outset. And they are on track. They actually are, have more executive orders than their first 100 days, I think, I think you have to go back to FDR in his first administration for anything even close. So it would make sense that they would slow down a bit, but they don't seem to be slowing down that much. Although it does seem like that we're kind of predicting the kind of catastrophe they're doing a little bit better, right? I haven't seen any giant. It seems like the pace of big surprises is slowed,
Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions for Chris before we adjourn tonight? All right. Well, thank you all so much for attending, and thank you, Chris, for being such a gracious presenter. It's always illuminating to listen to you speak. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a lovely night, and we'll see you soon.
Thank
Take care.
you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.